Bannon and Navarro never spent a minute with the January 6th committee, never turned over a single document to our committee. These people had 0% compliance with Congress. They demonstrated true contempt, which is why they've been sentenced to jail. But Chairman Comer, in his wisdom, would hold the Attorney General of the United States of America in contempt for what I think is 100% compliance, but in any event is something like 98 or 99% compliance. If you think a federal official is not rendered proper compliance, you take them to court, you don't hold them in contempt, and it's rich beyond measure, like a billionaire rich, to be asked to hold the Attorney General in contempt by people who themselves received subpoenas to testify before the January 6th committee, who never rendered a single document nor a single minute of testimony to the January 6th committee. I urge Congress to reject this absurd motion, and I'm happy to yield back to the chairman.
The chair would remind members to refrain from engaging in personalities toward presumptive nominees for the office of president. Recognize the gentleman from Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I never said I wouldn't testify in front of the January 6th committee. I just want to know what the parameters of that testimony were going to be. So I never did say no to that. Second, the speaker before just said we don't know what we're looking for. We're looking for equal treatment under the law. Special Counsel Hur found Joe Biden knowingly kept classified information. Joe Biden knowingly disclosed classified information. He told us that on the very first page of his report. And then he told us later why he did so. He said he had strong motivation for ignoring classified procedures because he was writing a book for which he got paid $8 million. Again, we have motive, and we have him knowingly disclosing classified information. But he doesn't get charged. Yet President Trump does. President Trump does by Jack Smith. Jack Smith, the guy who had to file with the court a notice saying that he actually altered the order of the documents he seized on the raid of the president's home. He had to tell the court that. The physical documents don't match up with the scanned documents. You're not allowed to change the sequence of the documents you seized. But Jack Smith did. Jack Smith mishandled the documents he's accusing President Trump of mishandling. You can't make this stuff up. That's what we're focused on. And oh, by the way, we're in the midst of an impeachment inquiry. We're entitled to the best evidence. That's why we want the audio tape. With that, I yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the crime subcommittee, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Biggs.
Thank you. I thank the gentleman for yielding. You know, during his testimony before the House Judiciary Committee, Special Counsel Hur stated that, quote, the evidence and the president himself put his memory squarely at issue, close quote. In his report, Special Counsel Hur noted that during both his and Zwanitzer's interviews with President Biden, the president's memory was significantly limited. President Biden has contested that. The Democrats contest that. But in reality, it's the failure to fully comply with the committee's subpoenas regarding the audio recordings of the Biden and Zwanitzer interviews that has hindered the House's ability to adequately conduct oversight over Special Counsel Hur regarding his investigative findings and the president's retention and disclosure of classified materials, and has impeded the committee's impeachment inquiry. So, the committee must assess whether the Special Counsel Hur's decision, which was based on President Biden's poor mental state, was consistent with the department's commitment to impartial justice, or whether legislative reforms are necessary regarding special counsel investigations because they are not leading to impartial outcomes. In short, the audio recordings would offer unique and important information to advance the committee's impeachment inquiry and inform the Judiciary Committee as to the need for legislative reforms to the operations of the department or the conduct of special counsel investigations. Those are legislative purposes, they are constitutional purposes, and they justify us getting the audio recordings. But they don't want the audio recordings to come forward. Why is that? It's odd, isn't it? Because the DOJ admitted in court filings 2 weeks ago that they actually did alter the transcript. They claim, oh, there's just filler information. Maybe there were duplicative words. There were blank pauses in there that were not noted in the transcript. That's why an audio recording is important, because the transcripts do not reflect important verbal context, such as tone or tenor, or nonverbal context, such as pauses or pace of delivery, all of which went into the decision by Mr. Hur not to prosecute a crime that he said was committed. That prosecutorial discretion is under review by our committee legitimately and constitutionally. We have the right to that audio recording. The department has said they're not going to give it to us. Odd. Because the cases that deal with requiring the audio recording to be turned over, the long skein of cases, they turn on various things like the audio recording is the best evidence. They say that. Odd. They also say that if there's tampering or any kind of editing or altering of the written transcript, which we now know is true, then the audio recording is mandatory. That's why we should get it. This department won't give it to us. Merrick Garland is in contempt of this Congress, and he needs to be held in contempt. With that, I yield back.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. McClintock.
I reserve.
Chairman reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is absurd. This is Fellini in the Congress. Comparing what Joe Biden did to what the other fellow that preceded him in office did in keeping documents in Mar-a-Lago in his bathroom and out in the fancy rooms where all of his billionaire friends go, is like comparing somebody that writes a bad check by $2 an overdraft to somebody who's a bank robber with guns and weapons and machine guns going on into banks and robbing money. Biden was a sympathetic figure, said Mr. Hur, a Republican who Merrick Garland gave the duty to study that case. He was a sympathetic figure. You don't commit a crime unless there is guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Mr. Hur found there could not be guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. What the other fellow did, refusing to comply with requests to give the documents, classified documents up, refusing, and then having to have a search warrant and finding them, hundreds of documents. not for the purpose of writing a book for somebody who can't even read a book, but for purposes that we don't know and what they were used for. But they were taken illegally and improperly. Merrick Garland is an honorable and good man who should be in the College of Cardinals and not being tried for contempt by this Fellini.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentleman an additional 30 seconds.
Thank you, sir. I have not seen a more diligent and honorable Attorney General in the times I've served in Congress. Merrick Garland is a superb individual, and this is just projection, trying to throw things off from the other fella, Trump, and put him on Biden. There's no comparison. Once again, it's like comparing a bank robber to a guy that wrote an overdraft. I yield back the balance of my time.
I reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Bishop.
Before recognizing Mr. Bishop, let me, the chair would remind members again to refrain from engaging personalities toward presumptive nominees for the office of president. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentleman from California. This matter is simple, and in its simplicity is the clarity of its appropriate resolution. The audio recording of President Biden's interview with Special Counsel Robert Hur is demeanor evidence. Demeanor is one's outward manner, a way of conducting oneself, one might say, is bearing. And in some circumstances, demeanor evidence is the most probative, powerful evidence that can be heard. Better than words, it can evidence credibility or evasiveness and avoidance. And especially in this circumstance, it can evidence a witness's capacities to observe, recall, and relate information accurately. President Biden shared classified information with his ghostwriter in pursuance of securing his $3 million book advance. Mr. Hur attributed the Justice Department's decision not to recommend prosecution of President Biden for misusing, mishandling classified documents on this and other occasions to the facts that he is an elderly man with poor memory. A raw transcript doesn't inform the Judiciary Committee sufficiently to evaluate the reasonableness of that determination, especially since President Biden hotly contested Special Counsel Hur's characterization. Demeanor evidence could powerfully clarify whether that exercise of prosecutorial discretion was politically neutral or politically freighted. In fact, it is the very power of the demeanor evidence in the audio of Biden's interview that Garland inadvertently acknowledges in stubbornly withholding it. If it were nothing more than a duplicate of the transcript, it would never have been refused. The Justice Department, the Attorney General have not a leg to stand on. Their refusal is the essence of contempt. Garland's own words reflect it in the hearing before the Judiciary Committee the other day. He said certain members of this committee have marked up a contempt resolution. But as I pointed out to the Attorney General, it was a majority of the members of the committee, and he retracted those words. A majority of the committee charged by a majority of this House with inquiring into the existence of grounds to exercise the awesome constitutional power of impeachment. The Attorney General's reference to certain members reflects a political mindset that does not support withholding evidence that the committee seeks that is squarely relevant and essential to its inquiry. That defiance, the House cannot abide. Therefore, this resolution for contempt must pass this House. I yield.
Reserve.
Gentleman from California reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield a minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Schiff.
Contempt. To hold something as beneath the dignity of consideration, something to be scorned, an attitude towards something that is inferior, worthless, open disrespect for something that is vile, despised, disgraced, insolence in the presence of the law. An apt description not of the subject of this motion, but of those who bring it. Not of an Attorney General who has upheld our justice system, who has demonstrated a respect for our institutions, but of those who mock the idea that we are a nation of laws, not the individual. When Republicans line up in front of a Manhattan courthouse to denigrate the rule of law in the service of a now convicted felon, that is contemptuous. When Republicans peddle the lie that Joe Biden is pulling the levers of Trump's Manhattan prosecution, that is contemptuous. When Republican committee chairmen ignore their own subpoena, but feign indignation when the Attorney General complies with his, that is contemptuous. That is deserving of our scorn. That is beneath the dignity of this body. That is vile, disgraceful, and worthy. I have additional 30 seconds? That is deserving of our scorn. That is beneath the dignity of this body. That is vile, disgraceful, and worthy of derision. Those who bring this motion bring contempt, all right, but only upon themselves. I yield back.
Reserve.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, I will yield 3 minutes to myself.
So recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, for the first time in American history, a presidential administration is trying to jail its opponent. And not just any opponent, but a former president of the United States. To pursue this objective, Mr. Biden's Attorney General approved an unprecedented armed raid on a former president's home, despite strenuous objections by his career officials and the local field office that normally would have had jurisdiction. He then created a new position without the constitutional requirement of congressional action or Senate confirmation. He filled that position with one Jack Smith, despite the central role Smith had played in the IRS scandal that targeted and harassed Tea Party volunteers, and despite a long history of prosecutorial misconduct. The cooked-up charge was the mishandling of classified documents. Well, shortly thereafter, we discovered that as vice president, Joe Biden had done the same thing. Yet, as president, Mr. Trump had absolute authority to declassify materials at will. As vice president, Joe Biden did not. As president, Mr. Trump had absolute authority to determine what records to keep upon leaving office. As vice president, Joe Biden did not. Yet, the Biden administration's appointed special counsel in the Biden case concluded that although Biden had, quote, willfully retained and disclosed classified materials when he was a private citizen, criminal charges were not warranted because he's, quote, a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. Well, the principal justification for this glaring double standard in the handling of these two cases was the interview with Mr. Biden. Yet all we have is the unverified transcript to determine the validity of this otherwise inexplicable decision. Mr. Biden cannot claim executive privilege. This was not a policy discussion, and he's already released the transcript. But it is vital that our committee know if the transcript is complete and whether it accurately portrays the circumstances under which that decision was made. 2 Trump officials have been sentenced to prison for their failure to honor congressional subpoenas. And that case was far weaker than this one because at the time, Congress was not exercising oversight or considering legislation. In this case, the Judiciary Committee is doing both. Yet once again, we have this glaring legal double standard at play. Now, I expect the Attorney General to thumb his nose at the citation. We've come to expect that of him. But the House Judiciary Committee is charged with defending and upholding the rule of law and its fundamental principle of equal justice under law. And if we're going to restore them, this resolution is an indispensable step that we must take today. And I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of the time. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Mr. Speaker, the gentleman just attacked Special Counsel Smith. This dangerous attempt to demonize anybody who would hold Donald Trump accountable for his actions is despicable, and it is a full-out assault on the basic tenets of our democracy. I want to remind my colleagues that these types of actions have consequences. They affect the lives of many men and women who have dedicated themselves to public service and upholding the rule of law. I will submit for the record a June 11, 2024 article in the Washington Post by the Honorable Merrick Garland entitled, "Unfounded Attacks on the Justice Department Must End." It is absurd and dangerous that public servants, many of whom risk their lives every day, are being threatened for simply doing their jobs and adhering to the principles that have long guided the Justice Department's work. I would also remind my friend on the other side of the aisle that the conviction of Mr. Trump was in a state court in New York, having nothing to do with the federal government. And I now yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Swalwell.
Before recognizing the gentleman, members are still reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities toward the president or toward the presumptive nominee. The gentleman is recognized.
This is not about the contempt of the Attorney General. It's about MAGA Republicans' contempt for the Constitution, the rule of law, and democracy. And it's about who any of us came here to fight for. MAGA Republicans are fighting for one person at the cost of what your constituents actually care about. You're fighting for a felon. You're fighting for a felon.
By the direction of the Committee on the Judiciary, I call up House Report 118-527.
The clerk will report the title of the report.
Report to accompany House Resolution 1292, resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find United States Attorney General Merrick B. Garland in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with a subpoena duly issued by the Committee on the Judiciary.
Pursuant to the House Resolution 1287, the report is considered read. For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, seek recognition?
Committee on the Judiciary, I call up House Resolution 1292 and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the title of the resolution.
House Resolution 1292, resolution recommending that the House of Representatives find United States Attorney General Merrick B. Garland in contempt of Congress for refusal to comply with a subpoena duly issued by the Committee on the Judiciary.
Pursuant to House Resolution 1287, the resolution is considered read. The resolution shall be debatable for 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on the Judiciary, or their respective designee. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, and the gentleman from New York, Mr. Nadler, will each control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and to insert extraneous material on this measure.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, you myself such time as I may consume. On page 1 of his report, Special Counsel Hur said President Biden, quote, willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen. Joe Biden not only kept information he wasn't allowed to keep, he shared it with people who weren't allowed to get it. And on page 231, the special counsel told us why President Biden did this. He said, quote, President Biden had strong motivations to ignore proper procedures for safeguarding the classified information in his notebooks. He had decided months before leaving office to write a book for which he got paid $8 million. So we have motive, an $8 million motive. We have the elements of the crime: knowingly keeping classified information, knowingly disclosing classified information. But despite all this, Special Counsel Hur declined to recommend prosecution for President Biden because Joe Biden is, quote, a sympathetic, well-meaning elderly man with a poor memory. On page 207 of his report, Special Counsel Hur said Mr. Biden's memory also appeared to have significant limitations, both at the time he spoke to the ghostwriter, Mr. Swanitzer, in 2017, as evidenced by their recorded conversations, and today as evidenced by his recorded interview with our office. The committees need the audio recordings to determine whether the Justice Department appropriately carried out justice by not prosecuting the president. Because remember what they told us. Justice Department said, we're going to operate independent of the White House. They said, we'll be impartial, independent arbiters of the facts. Okay, Maybe so, but what we do know is this. One former president's being charged, Joe Biden's not being. We think we're entitled, actually we know we're entitled, to all the evidence and the best evidence. And the transcripts alone are not sufficient evidence of the state of the president's memory, especially since the executive branch has a history of changing transcripts. We saw this in late April. The transcript the White House put out didn't match the video and audio recording of President Biden's speech. And only after the White House was caught did they change the transcript. And in that case, and in this case, the audio recording is the best evidence of the words that President Biden actually spoke. Following the release of Special Counsel Hur's report, both the Judiciary Committee and the Oversight Committees issued subpoenas requiring Attorney General Garland to turn over the transcripts of the audio recordings of Special Counsel Hur's interviews with President Biden and his ghostwriter. To date, the Attorney General has failed to produce those recordings. In fact, he told us last week he wasn't going to do it, and that is why we're here. Despite the committee's best efforts, the department has continued to withhold the audio recordings of those interviews without providing any constitutional or legal basis to do so. Just hours before the committee was set to meet and consider the contempt resolution, the department notified the committee that President Biden had asserted, at the Attorney General's urging, executive privilege over the audio recordings. It's simple. Attorney General Garland holds information vital to the committee's legislative oversight and the House impeachment inquiry. Remember, this body voted December 13th of last year to enter that phase of our oversight duty and impeachment inquiry. The department has a legal obligation to turn over the requested material. Attorney General Garland's willful refusal to constitutes contempt of Congress. This resolution upholds the institutional power of the House by recommending that the House find Attorney General Merrick Garland in contempt of Congress for failing to comply with the committee's subpoena. Our oversight and impeachment responsibilities are too important to allow the Attorney General to willfully disregard this. I urge my colleagues to support this resolution, and we reserve the balance of our time.
Gentleman from Ohio reserves. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the president. What person? The gentleman from New York seek recognition.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the dishonesty that we have just heard is illustrated by what Mr. Jordan just said. His selective quote from Mr. Hur's report. He said, "Our investigation uncovered evidence that President Biden willfully retained and disclosed classified materials after his vice presidency when he was a private citizen." The report does say that. But he neglects a sentence, a paragraph later. However, for the reasons summarized below, we conclude that the evidence does not establish Mr. Biden's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. That is deceptive. Secondly, as the majority well knows,